Simon Marks joins us, LBC's US correspondent. He's live in Washington, D.C. Simon, very good evening to you. Is this a surprise to you?
Well, it's not a tremendous surprise, Ian, because there is still every possibility that the judge in this case is going to throw the lawsuit out. The judge is just not doing that now. I mean, what the BBC was engaged in here was an effort to avoid the whole process of discovery. And for anybody that has ever watched any kind of criminal trial on American television, you will know that there is this process of discovery whereby lawyers for both sides are required to share every document that they've got in their possession relating to the case at hand, whether criminal or civil. So the BBC was saying, well, hang on a second, there's no point in even engaging in discovery where we have to hand all of our notes over to the Trump side and the Trump side has to hand all of its evidence over to us, because we're going to push for a very, very early dismissal of this lawsuit by arguing that Florida doesn't have the jurisdiction to hear the case, because the BBC says that Donald Trump has not proved that a single person in Florida was in any way aggrieved by that broadcast of Panorama, nor that a single person in Florida changed their vote as a result of that broadcast of Panorama. What the judge in the case is saying is, well, the process of discovery has to go ahead because the trial is going to begin on February the 15th, 2027, and only then will the judge begin to hear arguments about whether or not the case should be dismissed. I mean, this does suggest that Donald Trump has sort of won half a round in that it indicates that the judge isn't throwing his criminal complaint back at Trump's lawyers and saying, you've got to go and rewrite this thing, which is what a judge did when Donald Trump launched a lawsuit against the New York Times seeking $15 billion in damages. Just on the numbers, by the way, the situation for the BBC is potentially even worse than $7.5 billion. Trump is seeking $10 billion. So it's £7.5 billion that they might maybe one day have to come up with in order to pay Donald Trump were Trump to win this lawsuit completely. But we are still a very long way away from that. This is just the beginning, as you can tell, of what is going to be a very drawn-out legal process. And on top, of course, of the money that the BBC is risking here as it goes forward with this process, is going to be now the vast amounts of money that the BBC has to shell out to lawyers who are going to be representing it even between now and February of next year when the trial gets underway. So that's going to be a hefty bill one way or another, because the one thing you can always be guaranteed about American jurisprudence is that it's always the lawyers who win.
So basically, even if the BBC wins the case, they would still have had to fork out maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. But one question I have here is, how does a Florida court have jurisdiction over this? Surely if he wants to sue the BBC, he should be doing it in the High Court in London.
Well, that is absolutely the key question, because if you read the criminal complaint, reading the complaint as written by Donald Trump's lawyers, you are presented with a reality in which the BBC is a broadcasting powerhouse in the Sunshine State of Florida, which is simply untrue, absolutely beggars belief. And while there's lots of fulmination in the complaint, the civil complaint that Donald Trump is bringing about the impact of the transmission of Panorama in Florida and its opportunity to try and sway the opinions of voters there, I mean, there are some harsh realities. Number one, Donald Trump clearly won the Sunshine State of Florida. There is no evidence that anybody changed their vote as a result of having seen Panorama, nor is there any evidence that anybody did see Panorama. The complaint insists that that edition of Panorama was carried by BritBox, which is a web-distributed service here that allows you to peruse the best of programming from both the BBC and ITV here in the United States. The BBC says it was never on BritBox. So jurisdiction internationally, they think at New Broadcasting House that they've got a strong case to call for the dismissal of this lawsuit on jurisdictional grounds. And certainly courts in Florida have not always been friendly to similar court actions brought against the media by Donald Trump. But it's clearly a roll of the dice.
Simon, thank you. That's Simon Marks, LBC's US correspondent. Well, Jonathan Coad joins me now, media lawyer. Jonathan, very good evening to you. Can we start on this jurisdiction point? Because a lot of people would be thinking, well, how does he come up with the figure of 10 billion? And if he wins the case, does the BBC really have to fork out that money, given that it's a Florida court, not a British court?
OK, well, if you're starting with the issue of the figure, in America, damages are calculated theoretically in the same way as the UK, but in practice very differently. Your US correspondent rightly considered, well, shouldn't he be bringing the claim in the UK, which is a very good question. Actually, he's out of time to do that, so he's not going to manage that. In America, there are, just as in the UK, there are two sorts of damages. There's what we lawyers call compensatory damages, which essentially what it means, what it says on the tin. And then there are punitive damages. Now, we have a form of punitive damages in the UK, but it's the threshold to get them is very high. They're very rarely ordered, and they're relatively modest. Now, the most you're ever going to get in the UK in a libel action is about £300,000. And that's a limit that the Court of Appeal set some time ago. But in America, there is no limit. And the risk that the BBC faces is what the Americans call, as I say, punitive damages, which are, again, to use a legal phrase, are at large. So they could be as big as the jury wants them to be. But I want to pick up on the jurisdiction point, and I hope it's not rude as a guest on LBC, but I wanted to correct your American correspondent on one thing. I've conducted actions in America. From the UK, I've walked through libel actions. I'm a UK lawyer, but I'm pretty familiar with the US court system and the law of defamation. And I've checked this up. It's not necessary for Donald Trump to show that anyone changed their vote. The threshold for defamation in America is not very different from the UK definition, which is a publication which lowered you in the estimation of right-thinking people. And that essentially is common to both sides, that there are then differences. So he doesn't have to show that anyone changed their vote. I don't think that's going to be the big issue. And I've checked this, I've checked the BBC commentary on this. Their motion to dismiss, which we call an application to strike, but it's the same principle, says that Florida lacks the personal jurisdiction. And that is correctly described by a correspondent as essentially saying no one in Florida saw the program. Now, that is a fairly straightforward issue, which the judge can take discreetly before the judge looks at anything else. He can ask that simple issue. Do I have jurisdiction? Has anyone in Florida, in the whole of Florida, seen this program? I think there's one other point which I think it needs to be brought out, and as again mentioned by a correspondent, the significant of today's decision. So where we are is that the judge has said to the BBC, yes, you can have your motion to strike, which is going to be heard in a year's time and for a couple of weeks. Hearing that would be the same kind of time as it would take in the UK, because there'll be lots and lots of arguments. But critically and very damagingly for the BBC, he has said, but in the intervening 12 months, you're going to have to go through the disclosure process. Now, in America, that is a massive exercise. And as your American correspondent rightly says, in America, the legal system does generally seem to be run for the benefit of lawyers. Dickens said of our Chancery Division in his day, the chief purpose of the Chancery Division is to provide gainful employment for lawyers. Well, that could certainly be true of the American legal system. Now, I've conducted a transatlantic case, actually, funnily enough, for a broadcaster, where simultaneously the case was going on in the UK and in America. And I was doing the UK case in the day and the American case in the evening. Now, in that case, on a relatively narrow issue, it was effectively a copyright case. My client broadcaster had to produce 35,000 documents. Now, I had to sit and read those. It took me an awful long time. But pause here for a minute.
All chargeable time, though.
All chargeable time. Yes, indeed. Yeah, the pension fund had a reasonably good contribution that year. But pausing here for a minute, this is why I think it's a real blow for the BBC. And they were desperately keen to avoid having to give disclosure. Now, this is why. So the fundamental allegation by Donald Trump is that the BBC exhibited bias against him. Now, I'm a great fan of the BBC. Many years I've been on TV and radio programs supporting them. Are they guilty of bias against Donald Trump? Yes, I believe they are. And that issue mustn't be lost sight of amongst all the rules and the money that to do with the American litigation. Has our national broadcaster produced biased content about an American president? That's an issue which concerns us all and is independent.
Well, it does, but do they not have to prove, or does Trump not have to prove intent? Because it was clearly, this splicing was done by presumably one individual, and whether they did it deliberately or not is open to conjecture. I probably think they did. But the fact that it wasn't spotted by editors is, of course, a bad thing for the BBC. But is anyone seriously suggesting that the BBC said to one of its producers, right, edit this in the way that make Trump looks bad? Because that's quite a difficult thing to prove.
Okay, well, you use the term intent, and I'm going to translate that into the lawyer term, which is malice. Now, in the UK, you do not have to prove malice to win a libel action. In America, you do. For all public figures, and of course, Donald Trump's a public figure, you have to establish what we both sides of the Atlantic call malice. And that means that either you knew that the allegation was untrue, or you were reckless as to whether it's true or not. Now, I've legaled out television programs for 35 years, something like that. Now, there is no way and I've worked with the BBC, I know how careful and cautious they are. Everything that you hear or view on the BBC or any other British broadcaster, any broadcaster, is legaled by lawyers. You'll have a lawyer somewhere at LBC who'll be listening to this program and will be sending something into your ear. So Coad said something disastrous, you need to contradict it, or deny it or whatever. Now, to use, let's go through the process. So first of all, on the issue of intent, you may or may not know that this was the second time the BBC did this. It wasn't the first time, it was the second time, because some months before, Newsnight did exactly the same. It spliced two bits of the speech together to give the same impression. So, does that suggest intent, use that word? Well, yes, it does. Now, secondly, you are going to have to legal any program that goes out as a broadcast very carefully, because firstly, there are the laws of defamation, but secondly, there are the Ofcom rules. Now, paragraph 7.1 of the Ofcom code says that broadcasters must avoid unfair treatment of the subjects of their broadcast. Now, as I say, I've worked in the broadcast industry for 35 years. I know that's taken very seriously. Now, it's not a question of the editors missing it. The editors will not have missed it, I do not believe. It wasn't made by the BBC, it was made by an independent production company, but that they have the same rules as BBC editors. It won't have been missed. A decision must have been made that they were going to transmit that edited version of his speech, which gave the impression, as the BBC has admitted, that he made an immediate call to violence. That was not done by mistake. So in that it was done deliberately, intentionally, I can't remember what your word was, then the question comes is, well, why was that done? Now, going back to the issue of discovery, what the American lawyers are going to say, I am sure, is So they'll look at the Newsnight program, and then they'll look at the Panorama program, but they'll say that these two programs are evidence of an institutional bias at the BBC against Donald Trump. Now, I think the court will accept that, and I also think that's right. So what's then going to happen is that the BBC are going to have to go through for a period of years all their emails, memos, notes of meetings, goodness knows what, any that mention Donald Trump. Now, I ask you rhetorically, is it likely that there is no email, memo, note of meeting emanating from someone at the BBC criticising Donald Trump? Well, there'll be thousands, tens of thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of them. And what that means is that even if they are able to strike the action out in February, which they may or may not be able to do, then the BBC are going to have to effectively own up to the fact that they did have an institutional bias.
And this is an important point, isn't it? Because this case will likely be heard by a jury. And I mean, yes. Florida is quite Trumpy. So if you've got a majority of Trump supporters on the jury who might feel some sort of loyalty to Trump, that would not bode well for the BBC, potentially.
No, it will absolutely will not. However, I'm pretty sure, Ian, and I'm virtually sure, that the motion to strike will be held by a judge alone. So that will take away the jury factor, which we don't have in the UK courts. We used to have jury trials when I started out, we still had jury trials for defamation we haven't had for years. So they do have a better chance. But my point is this, is that they will still have to give disclosure of a vast amount of material, which is likely to be highly embarrassing, highly sensitive, including, for example, minutes of the board, minutes of direct meetings with the director. So it's probably, I suspect, going to emerge that right from the top down, there was an institutional dislike of Donald Trump. That's going to be something which is going to cause irreparable damage to the BBC, even if they succeed in February in striking the claim out.
Well, Jonathan, that's been really interesting. We've spoken for a lot longer than I was potentially intending to, because it is such a complicated case, and it's important that our listeners get the full story. Thank you very much indeed. That's Jonathan Coad there, a media lawyer. Well, you can see the